Kingdom. We are excited to be able to head back down to our feature match area right now as we get ready for more Legacy here in England. Hello and welcome to this round 4 here at Grand Prix Birmingham in Legacy. Legacy is what we're working with, and we have Pascal Viren. He is on Elves and he's up against Anand Kare, who is playing Mono Red Prison. So you see an early Simian Spirit Guide alongside Ancient Tomb there, and indeed he's got a Mox in play as well there, Mox Diamond. Sorry, that's Chrome Mox exiling the Simian Spirit Guide. Getting to cast a Blood Moon on the very first turn of the game, that meaning that Verdant Catacombs for Pascal Viren taps for red mana, not very much help for his Elves.
Yeah, and being on the play is super important for the Mono Red Prison deck. You actually get those taxing effects, the Blood Moons, the Trinispheres, out before somebody like Pascal can fetch out a basic land.
So we have, in addition to Blood Moon, we have Trinisphere in play, and a second Blood Moon, a second Trinisphere for Anand here. All spells are costing 3. He's the only one that's got 3 mana to work with just now. And Pascal Viren, in spite of being a mono-green deck, thus far has not found anything that he can cast with all of that red mana that his lands tap for. Playing a Morph here, likely a Birchlaw Rangers.
Yep.
But it is a 2-2 that can successfully tussle with Magus of the Moon, yet another Blood Moon effect for Anand here. And ultimately, this mono-red prison deck, it's doing exactly what it wants to do here. This is exactly the dream it wants to be living, making it so that its opponent can essentially not cast spells, at which point Magus of the Moon, yes, it's not a very exciting beatdown card, neither Simian Spirit Guide, but they'll kind of be good enough.
Yeah, but at the same time, the threats that Anand has drawn are not all that exciting. 2/2 beatdown creatures. What he really needs is something like a Planeswalker to take this game down.
I mean, his list is running Chandra, Torch of Defiance. I know that some lists are looking at running Khan, Scion of Urza, at some point within its list as well. He also has Goblin Rabblemaster to work with, another 3-cost card that represents a pretty sizable threat, generating goblins each and every turn.
I think Mono Red Prison is also a nice choice for this event. This is a double GP after all, so if you don't play a lot of Legacy, I think Mono Red Prison is a deck where simply because you are playing Trinisphere, you can win a lot of against a lot of more experienced players.
So the beats keep on coming from Anand as he finally hits his 4th mana here. Hitting the first 3 on turn 1, not so big of a deal, but the 4th one took a little longer.
Yeah, now we will see if he's actually holding Chandra.
Sometimes you see Pia and Kiran Nallar as well from these mono-red lists as a way of getting threats on the battlefield for 4 mana.
To be fair, if he had been holding Chandra, he wouldn't have cast the Simian Spirit Guide. Pretty sure about that.
And Pascal Viren fast approaching the point where he has to figure out what he wants to discard here. Each and every card in his hand costs green mana. And while naturally something like a Pendelhaven, a Gaia's Cradle does tap for green, no hope of that with Blood Moon in play. 2 copies of Blood Moon in play for Anand Kare thus far.
A bit of glare now, but those were the Blood Moons and the Trinispheres that we already saw.
And a Chalice of the Void on 1. That a very potent card against Elves as well. Just seeing that Gaia's Cradle enough for Pascal Viren's deck to be made clear, even if it weren't for the Nettle Sentinel and so on in his graveyard. Gaia's Cradle, a very powerful card, but only one really deployed by Elves in Legacy.
Oh, it's really quite impressive how Anand is dismantling Elves here. A single forest would have made a whole lot of difference, but also Trinisphere is very powerful against Elves.
Yeah, it's easy to say that the red deck, having the play, ends up being very good as Fiery Confluence there, dealing a whole host of damage to Pascal Viren happens. If it had worked out that Elves was on the play here, yes, it would have ended up getting a little bit more mana going early doors, but Trinisphere is still kind of a problem for the Elf deck.
Yeah, but on the other hand, your creatures do produce mana, so I think Pascal on the play would have been much better off. This is not an easy matchup for Elves. Even on the play, cards like Chalice of the Void, Trinisphere are very problematic.
You can see Anand there as he figures out his sideboarding. Originally from the US, but currently living in London, and as such, a relatively short little jaunt up the road to get to this Grand Prix in Birmingham. Meanwhile, Pascal has come across from Belgium, and having had a reasonable amount of success on the Pro Tour just recently, enjoying getting a bit of legacy in before potentially jumping across to standard, depending on how things pan out for him in the next few rounds. Both these players currently on 4-0, so exactly where they would want to be, but plenty of time for the wheels to come off yet. The Elves deck, one of the decks that I really like in this legacy format, because it can be explosive, but it's also kind of a puzzle. It's got lots of moving parts to it, and it can operate with a little bit of a toolbox function, because it does have Green Sun, Zenith, and Natural Order to work with. On occasion, if it can't just straight up win the game with those cards, it can find answers to a lot of things that opposing decks are trying to do.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult to classify, because you're doing... I wouldn't say you're doing anything like strictly better than other decks. I wouldn't say you're the best combo deck, or you're definitely not the best aggro deck, but somehow you have game against most decks in the format, and it really rewards you for knowing the ins and outs of your decks, the outs that you have with cards like Natural Order, with cards like Glimpse of Nature, and also when you look at your sideboard and suddenly you have all those black cards, Thought Seizes, Abrupt Decays, Mind Break Traps. It's really, really tough to make the right calls, because ultimately you don't want to dilute your combo.
And a lot of the combo when it comes to Elves is simply having collections of creatures that can generate a startling amount of mana given the turn count. Occasionally you'll see, maybe more than occasionally, you'll see a Craterhoof Behemoth fetched up at the appropriate moment to close games out in one big hit. And you really don't need very many creatures in play for Craterhoof Behemoth to represent a lethal threat.
Yeah, that's actually the win condition. The one of the main engines in the deck is the combination of Nettle Sentinel and Heritage Druid. So Nettle Sentinel untaps whenever you cast a green spell, and Heritage Druid turns Nettle Sentinel into a mana producer. So that means you can actually get additional mana from your creatures. And if you combine it with something like, of course, Glimpse of Nature, then you can sometimes even draw your whole deck, just like we saw Louis Scott Vargas do when winning Proto Berlin.
Yeah, it's interesting that the Nettle Sentinel Heritage Druid part of the deck is something that will be familiar to modern players, but when you add in Glimpse of Nature, when you add in Quirion Ranger, even adding in Birchlaw Rangers just as another way of getting a little bit of redundancy sort of on the Heritage Druid effect, this deck can be incredibly explosive. And then there's Gaia's Cradle.
Yeah, Gaia's Cradle is just absurd, clearly. I also think playing with and against Wirewood Symbiote is really, really tricky as well. It protects your creatures, it makes more mana, and if you can't kill it when it comes down, it can be really a pain to deal with.
As things stand, though, Pascal Viren, the hands that he's keeping against Anand Kare's list might be a little bit altered just by the fact that he knows the kind of explosions that Anand can achieve on his very first turn.
Yeah. I think basic forest is something that's very valuable, or at least a creature that can produce green mana on its own. But at the same time, he wants certain answers, and those after sideboarding are black. So I think Thoughtseize is very valuable on the play, as is Abrupt Decay.
Now, looking at Anand's sideboard, in addition to the various disruption that he had in Game 1, he's got the potential to be casting Volcanic Fallout after sideboarding, which is a great leveler for if Pascal Viren gets off to a quick start here. It'll be interesting to see how the first couple of turns of this game go out, whether or not Pascal can get things going, as you see him immediately fetching a basic forest with that Misty Rainforest on the very first turn.
Yeah, and Volcanic Fallout, the fact that it can't be countered are not so important in this matchup, of course, but 2 damage will kill almost all creatures on Pascal's side of the board.
So Deathrite Shaman, it does pass the 1 mana creature that can tap for mana test. There is a Misty Rainforest in the graveyard, and it's likely that we're going to see a few more lands hitting the graveyard, at least for Pascal. Not so many fetch lands needed for the mono-red deck. it gets to just run Ancient Tomb, City of Traitors, and then lots of mountains as its mana base. Ancient Tomb into Chalice of the Void on 1, though. There are a lot of 1-drops in Pascal Viren's deck.
Yes, and now Pascal, it really depends on what he's holding. Of course, it also depends what Anand is working with. Does he have threats to follow this up with? Will he, for example, just play a Blood Moon and say, I think I'm winning this game if we go longer, because at some point I will have more lock pieces than you can possibly have answers? Okay, no play at all. That's not a lot, but nothing too scary going on here.
Now, Ancient Tomb, the land that Anand Kare has in play, in addition to that mountain there, taps for 2 mana, but it costs you 2 life every time you're tapping it for mana. It's great at accelerating you into your Blood Moon effect, and then it's almost a graceful reprieve to be able to get rid of those Ancient Tombs damaging you by turning them into mountains.
Yeah, and this might be a very, very quick game.
Natural Order for Progenitus. Progenitus, one of those cards that there are some matchups where Craterhoof Behemoth ends games faster, but 10-10 protection from everything. It's going to take 2 swings, but it's going to be very difficult for Anand to stop those 2 swings from happening.
Yeah, and in particular, Red is not known for being very good at dealing with Progenitus.
Natural Order, letting you search up a green creature. Conveniently enough, Progenitus, amongst other things, does have double green in its mana cost. I'm really intrigued as to what Anand might have to be able to get him out of this one. There are answers, in spite of having protection from everything. If you had the likes of Wrath of God, for example, it doesn't target, it doesn't deal damage. As such, the protection would not save Progenitus in that instance. As things stand, though, I don't think there's very much that will save Anand here. And we're going on to a game 3 with 38 minutes left on the clock. That one, it took almost as long to do sideboarding and shuffling as it did to get into the game. And going into game 3, Anand knows that he's going to be on the play. How big a deal is that in this matchup?
I think it's absolutely huge. I think whoever wins the die roll is favored to take down the whole match, in fact. So now with both... No, Pascal needs to break serve, basically.
And what are the key cards that might help him do that? Because it feels to me like if Anand gets his best draw, in some respects, there might be no cards that can do that.
Unfortunately, I think that's true. You can, I believe, still get there with things like Thoughtseize and enough basic lands. For example, if Anand has a turn 1 Blood Moon, but you drew one of your 2 forests, you can play a normal game.
And there are really only 2 basic forests in the Elves deck.
Yeah, you play 4 Cradles, and you actually play a really low land count to make your Glimpse of Nature as powerful as possible.
All right, so that will be a big concern for Pascal Viren, getting that basic land into play before Anand gets anything going. If Anand's first turn is a Chalice of the Void, while that's not good for Pascal, at least it gives him the option of being able to search up a basic land before the wheels come off. Whereas if Anand can do what he did in game 1 of getting into play a Blood Moon on the very first turn, following it up with a Trinisphere, then at that point the draws for Pascal, even after sideboarding, even after he's tried to improve his deck for the matchup, they could be very slim.
Yes, I do like Reclamation Sage. Elves plays usually one of those in the main deck, because it is just a catch-all answer to artifacts and enchantments, and you even have ways to recur it, to put it back into your hand and use the ability again. If Pascal has a draw that allows him to cast Reclamation Sage, for example, on a Chalice of the Void, that could be super powerful. But then we have to look at not only the lock pieces on Anand's side, but also the amount of pressure he puts up.
All right, so these players just shuffling up there we can see the Reclamation Sage. A bit of an upgrade over the likes of, for example, Viridian Shaman of the past, which might have been in that slot to only destroy artifacts. Getting artifacts or enchantments, it's a 2-1 for 3. Those numbers aren't particularly exciting, but the ability, very potent indeed.
Yeah, it's understandable that you want to have one of those in your main deck, especially because Green Sun Zenith can fetch it.
All right, 7 cards now. It's interesting. There's kind of a long history of red decks that are hoping to have a gigantic first turn. In Extended, there was all-in red, and there have been various variants on mono-red prison of sorts over the years. At one point it was called Dragon Stompy because the main threat that was being deployed was Rakdos Pit Dragon. These days, the threats have changed, but in some respects the disruption hasn't changed all too terribly much. Blood Moon a real big fixture in what's being attempted by the mono-red list.
Yeah, also just punishing a lot of the greedy 3-4 color decks in the format, of course. Sometimes playing 0 basic lands, going for all duels, all fetch lands, all wastelands. Another out here, another win condition for Pascal is actually that Anand's deck just doesn't deliver these super scary turn 1 starts. If everything that Anand does is, let's say, only a single turn delayed, it's a completely different game. It's almost like putting Pascal on the play if you don't have a lock piece early on.
So the early game here is essentially Anand figuring out whether or not his hand is good.
The
early
early
game will be turn 1.
The early games are the mulligans, and we are entering the mid game right now.
Yeah, looks like just the single mulligan. Card left on top for Anand here.
I see Simian Spirit Guide, so there is some explosiveness here. Is there a Chalice? Oh, Pascal with the Forest once again in the opening hand.
Well, there's a Mox exiling Simian Spirit Guide and ensnaring Bridge on turn 1. That's kind of an interesting one.
That's very surprising to me. Why would you even cast that so early?
Yeah, ensnaring Bridge, yes, it will mean that winning with a big Crater Hoof Behemoth or Progenesis is a little bit trickier. However, it's not the kind of disruption that's going to stop Pascal from getting things going, and that Bridge, it's very destroyable with the likes of the Reclamation Stage that we talked about.
No, I don't think Pascal minds at all. I think he's happy to see Ensnaring Bridge instead of something like Trinisphere, for example.
Yep, that Quirion Ranger can attack for 1 very happily, and here comes the Green Zenith for the first time in the game. It does get shuffled in every time you cast it, so we may well see plenty of times that this particular Searcher gets cast. At this point it's for 1, and it looks like it's for a Deathrite Shaman. Graveyard's comparatively empty right now, so this is kind of a preemptive measure more than anything else.
I think Anand is holding Fiery Confluence, so maybe that's what made him want to keep this hand. Just the potential to play it quickly and find the more relevant cards that way.
And Pascal Viren has actually just naturally drawn both of the forests in his deck this game. If we imagine game 1 where everything was exactly the same but the lands in his hand were those basic forests, it could have gone very differently indeed. Fiery Confluence, 3 modes, and you can choose to use them in any combination 3 times. So you can destroy lots of artifacts, deal lots of damage to creatures, or indeed opponents as needed.
No, but I don't think that's what you want to be doing in this matchup. It's not your plan to let the Elves player develop something and then kill some of their creatures. You have to lock them down. You have to have a Chalice, or at least a Trinisphere.
So here comes Magus the Moon. Right now, it's actually doing more about Anand's mana base than anything else. Yes, it means that he's no longer taking damage from those Ancient Tombs, but it does set him back in terms of overall volume of mana that he's able to produce.
No, but that's actually often a benefit, because the explosiveness of the Ancient Tombs, you've already gotten at that point, and then you turn off the damage.
So from here on out, Deathrite Shaman, about as bad as you'll ever see it right now, in as much as there are no cards in any graveyards, and Anand is not going to be putting any lands in his graveyard. Pascal, yes, he has fetch lands, but Deathrite Shaman with just the 1 graveyard to play with, it will take it a little bit longer to really get it for full value here.
So what you're saying is that it's an entirely fair Magic card?
Right now it is, unusually. We have Grey Ogres against Rime Dryads.
Yeah, maybe Anand can deploy some more Simian Spirit Guides and we will see a little bit of combat action, double blocking.
Well, I mean, if Anand can play the last card out of his hand, then all of a sudden there's not going to be any attacking at all, and we're back to unfair Magic rather than fair Magic.
True. But still, I don't quite understand what you're hoping to accomplish with the Ensnaring Bridge. I understand it's a solution to Progenitors, but only in a very passive way, because Progenitors is still going to sit there waiting to eat you.
Very hungry, rarely comes to dinner, but when he does, he eats everything. A little brief moment of pause here. It looks like Pascal Viren out of his seat, potentially just double-checking something with a judge before he continues. That is, of course, the prerogative of any of these players. And in fact, if you're looking to make a line of play that you think might be a little bit questionable in terms of how it works within the rules, far better to double-check before you get started than to accidentally find yourself coming a cropper.
Yeah, my guess would be that it could be something related to Dryad Arbor. How Dryad Arbor works under Magus of the Moon.
It's interesting. It's actually something I was talking about to one of the judges in between rounds, that with Magus of the Moon in play, it's still a creature, but the land side of it gets a little bit complicated. As things stand, though, that's just a bayou/mountain from Pascal Viren. Dryad Arbor, a recent rules change means that you do need to keep that Dryad Arbor in the creature zone as long as it is in fact a creature. And it may be that Pascal was double checking, well, if I play it right now, which zone does it need to be in? Because is it still a creature? Apparently, yes, the answer is it is. So Anand now figuring out what he wants to do with this turn. A second copy of Magus of the Moon. Just the one card in hand, so he can't be attacking, and Pascal doesn't especially want to attack. We have hit the mid-game with neither player having really set the world alight with their plays just yet, but Pascal, still lots of potential to do so. Gaia's Cradle representing a lot of additional mana potentially this turn.
Not really, it's a mountain.
If he taps all these lands for a Reclamation Stage, no, he's just going for a straightforward natural order.
This will be interesting. Let's see what he gets here. If it's Progenitors, then you know that he's not really concerned about Ensnaring Bridge.
All right, so we have a Progenitus with protection from everything, but a mortal fear of bridges.
It's one of the strongest bridges ever built.
I mean, either that or it's a rickety enough bridge that Progenitus doesn't even want to set one Hydra toe on it.
Because Progenitus is quite heavy.
Yes. All right, so along comes Chandra.
Finally. Now Anand is in this game, I feel. Before he was just casting his 3-mana cards, but the impact was really, really low.
So with Chandra on the battlefield, Anand has the potential to generate additional mana, to get additional cards off the top of his deck, good and cast, kind of generating velocity that way. And this feels to me like the kind of deck that can potentially even think about going for an emblem.
Yeah, probably not in this particular board state, I would say. But sure, yeah. Now it's a race against Reclamation Sage. Oh.
Uh-oh. Green Sun Zenith.
Short
X
race
equals 3. and Anand here, he almost preemptively picks up his Ensnaring Bridge, but there is the Reclamation Sage. That rickety bridge, as it turns out, all it took was a dirty look from a Reclamation Sage for it to fall down. And now Progenitus, with his incredible fear of bridges, no longer needs to worry about all of that bridgey nonsense and can just get stuck in here. 10 damage coming through. Will it be at Chandra? Will it be at Anand? It's pretty tempting to just try and close this one out and do two swings at Anand here.
I think it's exactly at this tipping point, because the one swing, if Anand stabilizes on 5, you haven't really gotten much out of it. If, for example, he manages to find another Ensnaring Bridge, which is now, I think, probably the only thing that could save him. Of course, it also depends on your hand. Yeah, okay.
Throw down a Wirewood Symbiote. Untap Deathrite Shaman. Play that Heritage Druid once more. Doing it all here. A lot of synergies in this elf deck. We've got some of the non-elf creatures doing their work there. Wirewood Symbiote alongside Progenitus. They're the best of buds.
The most important thing here now is that Pascal has a way to recur the Reclamation Sage. So there's actually no out for Anand. to get back into this game.
Yeah, he can return that Reclamation Sage to his hand to untap a creature, and in the meantime, Progenitus is just going to get stuck in, deal the damage needed to close out the game, and that means that after a shaky game one, we talked about Pascal Viren having to break serve in some way if he was going to win this, and ultimately, I don't know how much of that was Pascal having a masterful game three so much as Anand not really drawing the way that he needed to in order to be able to make the most of going first.
Mulligan to 6, and he accelerated out, I think, the wrong card. Of course, he didn't have a better one in hand, but accelerating out an Ensnaring Bridge and then not having that Chanda or something more powerful to follow up was his downfall.
Well, ultimately, we will have more magic for you here very shortly. Do not go anywhere. We're going to have some Time Walk magic for you right after these messages. Hello and welcome back to our Legacy here at Grand Prix Birmingham. Friday and Saturday, that'll be Legacy here in England. On Sunday, we'll move across to a little bit of Standard for you. But we have more magic for you here in round 5. Let's head back down to our feature match area for a little bit of a time walk. And here we get a chance to see Mark Tobias against Thomas Morrissey and a Street Wraith being cycled on the first turn here. Have we got Mark maybe porting something across that's more familiar in Modern, Simon?
Have we seen a Watery Grave yet?
Okay, fair. Now we have.
Good, good. Yeah, it's actually something that some of the German players have been working on. The Death Shadow deck, porting it to Legacy, where you can, in certain matchups, really take down your life total to let's say, single digits really, really early on. But Carsten Linden, my friend and teammate, played this deck at the Team Trios Constructed GP to an 8-0 finish on day 1.
Now he's up against Thomas Morrissey with Goblins. Goblins, one of the decks that historically has been a very scary one to face, and Goblin Lackey, the card revealed by Thoughtseize here, one of the reasons why. It also has Rishadan Port to potentially make doing things with your lands a little bit fiddlier in the early turns. Takes the Ether Vial here over Goblin Lackey, presumably that because there weren't any other goblins to worry about in hand there for Morrissey.
It's still a scary card to play against because of the potential it has. But Mark taking the Ether Vial probably means he has a good way of dealing with Goblin Lackey, or at least containing its potential.
So Ponder here coming from Mark Tobias. I guess that if Death Shadow is all about lowering your life total to make your big threats all the better, this is a deck that in principle could be running something like Force of Will in addition to the sort of things that we're used to seeing in Modern.
Of course, that's actually the beauty of it. You, by playing blue and of course Legacy, blue in Legacy, you have the opportunity to go down really, really low with your life total, and at the same time cards like Daze can protect you from going, while you're going all in, basically.
So here we have Goblin Lackey unable to attack because of an early Deathrite Shaman coming from the other side of things. Instead, Thomas Morrissey having to settle for the fact that he's got a Rishadan Port in play. He gets to tap down Watery Grave from Mark Tobias here. And with no other lands in the graveyard just yet, that means that Deathrite Shaman, he may just have to settle for being on the defensive against what's going on from a Goblin Lackey here. Wasteland dealing with that port by Mark, but is there going to be any further follow-up?
Well, to be fair, Mark doesn't really need anything else. He has the board completely under control. He is at a life total where he can start casting Death Shadow. And I don't know, it just feels like he's playing the more powerful deck overall.
So Death Shadow right this moment is a 1-1, but I think we have every reason to expect that to increase. You'll notice that Thomas Morrissey is keeping some cards upside down in his hand and the other way up. Though the ones that are upside down are the ones that he's already revealed to Mark Tobias, just so that he can keep track of what Tobias has and has not seen. And a cycled Gem Palm Incinerator here on Death Shadow. A little risky if there was the likes of a cycled Street Wraith there, but it does work out. Draw a card, kill your Death Shadow seems like a pretty good deal.
Yeah, there was a huge turn for Thomas. Like getting that to resolve and kill Death Shadow while drawing a card, cantripping basically. That's not something you can do very often.
Indeed, from now on it wouldn't work out quite so well. Polluted Delta here, meaning that Mark Tobias life total dropping into single digits, and he did pick up a Fatal Push this turn. I think he also has access to Force of Will. So everything gradually coming together for Tobias, even though the life totals are 20 for the Goblins player, just 9 on the other side of things. The second Death Shadow that's coming along, a little bit scarier, and alongside it is a 5/5 Gurmag Angler.
Yeah, I have a feeling that these creatures are going to be a lot tougher to deal with for Thomas. Mark keeps a Ponder in his graveyard so that he has the black activated ability of Deathrite Shaman still available.
Goblin Matron, that will allow Thomas Morris to search up any goblin and put it into his hand. Over the years, there have definitely been a wide variety of goblins that are worthy of searching up. And the existence of Goblin Matron, a pretty important piece of the puzzle in terms of being able to make this deck work, goes for a Sting Scourger. That a 2/2 Goblin that when it comes into play you get to bounce a creature. It does have Echo, so the second time around you do have to pay 4 mana if you want to keep it in play. But it's a Goblin that you get to search up that is a creature, but also kind of a spell.
Yes, but at the same time, are you really competing with the power level of something like this Death Shadow deck? All I see is really mediocre creatures. Goblin Lackey being stopped by Deathrite Shaman. Goblin Matron, okay, a powerful effect, but still you're paying 3 mana for a 1/1.
I mean, as I recall, the printing of Deathrite Shaman was one of the kind of nails in the coffin for goblins in many respects, because suddenly there was a 1-mana creature that could very happily block a Goblin Lackey without any concerns. And at the point where Goblins was at its best was at a time when having creatures to block on turn 1 was a little bit more unusual.
Exactly, when the format overall was a lot less creature heavy. But these times are long over. Now you just know you have to face Delvers and Deathrite Shamans from turn 1.
So Goblin Ringleader, a source of potential card advantage for Thomas Morrissey. Reveal the top 4 cards and put any goblins into your hand, and he did get a Goblin War Chief along with another Ringleader, which is a nice little combo, but at some point card advantage falls to just card quality, and the size of the threats that Mark Tobiash is putting down at some point relatively soon is going to be a problem for Thomas Morrissey to get out of.
But now Morrissey has at least something to threaten here, right? It's something where Mark cannot just ignore what's going on. He has to respect that there's some burst potential from Thomas. I don't think he's too concerned, but I like that now Thomas seems to be in the game at least a little bit.
So Tarfire, the Goblin Burn spell. Tribal, for those of you that care about card types in the graveyard. Thomas Morrissey is not one of those people, though he does not mind having a burn spell that he can search for with Goblin Matron. Alright, step 1, Tarfire on Deathrite Shaman. That does clear a path for an attack with Goblin Lackey.
Yeah, who needs Lightning Bolt when Deathrite Shaman has only 2 toughness, right?
Makes sense to me. A little parting shot there, generating some mana by exiling Counter Souls from Thomas Morrissey's graveyard. And here's the Fatal Push on Goblin Lackey. Not much that Thomas Morrissey can do about that one. He obviously would have loved to have been able to play a Goblin for free here, but that was not the world he found himself in. Having to pay 2 mana to cast that Sting Scourger, and the days in Mark Tobiash's hand not quite enough to do things there, though when another Lackey comes down, there might be a temptation for him to force spike it for the cost of picking up that Water Grave.
Could have just hard casted it, but he wants to take 2 more damage this turn.
Days the draw for the turn for Mark Tobiash here. He's also, by doing it that way, managed to get an extra card in the graveyard, so that if he did want to get Gomag Angler down once more, it's a little bit easier for him.
No, he would have gotten the days in the graveyard for sure. It was just a matter of whether he should hardcast it.
So the life total's now 7 to 10. The fact that Mark's life total is lower, ultimately kind of working in Mark's favour here, given that he's the one with the Death Shadow in play. And Thomas Morrissey looking at a hand of some goblins. He's got a War Chief, Gem Palm Incinerator, plus 1 more that I can't quite make out there, but that's the Tuk Tuk Scrapper. Very, very potent against artifacts.
What is that, a Goblin Ally?
A Goblin Ally. That means that whenever an ally you control comes into play, you get to destroy target artifact, and then your opponent loses life equal to the number of allies you control.
It was also hugely impactful this game.
So along comes Ether Vial on turn 1 for Thomas Morrissey. He puts a die on top of his deck there just to remind himself about putting a counter on that Ether Vial during his upkeep. Meanwhile, Mark Tobiash gets to cycle a Street Wraith before playing Verdant Catacombs. He's doing a great job of hurting his own life total, which, as counterintuitive as it may sound, is exactly what he wants to be doing to make sure that Death Shadow is all the more potent early doors.
I think we saw, now that I think about it, I think we saw why taking Ether Vial was so such a good decision by Mark, because he forced the Goblin deck to play on a very fair axis, while he is doing unfair things. Thomas had to pay full retail for all of his creatures. So somehow Etherval is one of the few cards that enable the Goblin deck to play an unfair game.
Morg Marshal coming down on turn 2 for Thomas Morrissey. It's got Echo, but he won't necessarily want to pay it, depending on what else he has going on. And no matter which way you slice it, it represents a couple of goblins in play for just a single card.
If you're playing an aggressive deck and your opponent is still happily taking extra damage, you know that things aren't looking too great.
Tobiash goes for the Thoughtseize here. He's going to see quite a nice hand. There's a Siege Gang Commander, Gempire Incinerator, Goblin Matron, and a Wasteland there.
And that Siege King Commander is a real threat at some point. But so is Goblin Matron, because it represents actually any kind of Goblin. Although I believe that Thomas has only that single Siege King Commander available to him.
So it takes the Matron, which represents a whole world of possibilities for Thomas Morrissey. And now he knows about Wasteland. There may be a temptation to play a basic land here, even though Mark would dearly love to get his life total below 12 so he can start casting Death Shadows. Or below 13, sorry. So on upkeep, Ethervial ticking up, and Echo is being paid for that Morg War Marshal.
That's what I call value. So, are you happy dealing some extra points of damage to Mark?
It's a really tricky one, and I think this was the quandary that a lot of modern players got faced with when Death Shadow first came out, was small attacks almost became bad attacks. You'd almost rather say, I'll wait on it to be lethal, and if I'm not being lethal, then I'll just have a little sit. However, it's very game specific which one you want to be doing there. And
yeah, but if your opponent is happily damaging themselves, then it has to be wrong to help them with that. It just doesn't feel right to me. You have to say, okay, then deal yourself as much damage as you have to. I will help with the final bits, but not any earlier.
So Cavern of Souls coming into play on turn 3. That's going to power out a Goblin Lackey. And just a pass back from Thomas Morrissey now. Mark Tobiash picks up a Force of Will. I don't believe that he's got a second blue card to go along with it.
Also, Force of Will quite weak against Cavern of Souls and Ethervial.
A lot of damage here that Mark Tobiash needs to deal on the other side of things, because the Death Shadow does not have any kind of evasion, and something like that Morg War Marshal represents 3 turns of blocking on one Death Shadow if Morrissey wants to play it that way.
No, but we can expect Mark to also bring in some cards against creature strategies. I fully expect him to have certain ways of dealing with a board full of goblins. Especially in black, that shouldn't be too difficult. Marsh Casualties is a card, after all.
As things stand though, Mark Tobiash content to attack in, kill off Morg War Marshal, and then carry along his merry way.
I am concerned about the Siege King Commander, though. How is Mark going to deal with that?
So, interesting little play there. Cycle Gem Palm Incinerator, coupled with the damage that had been dealt when the Morg War Marshal blocked Death Shadow, looked to be enough to successfully kill off the Death Shadow, but a Dismember in response on another creature meant that Mark Tobiash's life total that little bit lower, and of course the Cycle Gem Palm Incinerator dealing a little bit less damage. Suddenly, Death Shadow alive, Mark Tobiash a little bit less alive, but not so much that it's a big worry. Thomas Morrissey's play not quite as effectual.
Oh, that was a timely draw. Thoughtseize to get rid of the Siege King Commander that you know about. And Thomas actually, with a Vial on 4 and a 5th land in hand, so 2 ways of getting Siege King Commander into play. Mark Tobiash stops it just in time.
And now if you're Thomas Morrissey, there's a strong temptation not to tick up that Ether Vial any further. At least at 4, you've got Goblin Ringleader to potentially generate a little bit of card advantage. There might be the likes of Krenko Mob Boss, something like that he can put into play out on 4.
Yeah, and there shouldn't be any more 5 drops anyway, so we'll assume it's staying at 4 there. With the right top decks, Thomas is heavily favored to win here. At the same time, he is taking a bunch of damage, and now Death Shadow is threatening lethal with the help of a fetch land.
Now, within the pool of cards available in Legacy, obviously there's a lot more tools to work with for Death Shadow. Does it want to go as aggressive as the likes of something like Berserk?
There have been versions with Berserk tested for sure, because you want to be playing Tropical Island anyway, because of Deathrite Shaman. In the end, Death Shadow often, in a lot of matchups, is good enough just with a whole suite of counter magic. So you have the obvious inclusions, Force of Will, Daze, but also Stubborn Denial is an absolute all-star in any kind of Death Shadow deck. So at least Mark doesn't think that Berserk is necessary in this deck, or let's say in this metagame.
Interesting stuff. As things stand, it seems like the 2 lone goblins that are left for Thomas Morrissey are just going to be relegated to stepping in the way of Death Shadow at this point. Mark Tobiash, he's on 4 life, but he's already seen that there's nothing of any great worry in Thomas Morrissey's hand, so it's all just going to come down to these next couple of top decks as to whether or not he can get something going. And drawing into a Goblin Ringleader that he can cast off Ether Vial, absolutely fantastic draw here for Thomas Morrissey, because look at the velocity it's generated here.
Yep. And that was the one turn he had to top deck, because otherwise Mark Tobias uses a removal spell on the Goblin token and kills him.
So already the Ringleader, there's now the potential to attack with the Ringleader with haste as well.
The Ringleader has haste, so Mark is very close to that here.
Attacks for 3.
If Mark lets that resolve, his Misty Rainforests are turned off.
And in fact, that's enough. It works out that Mark Tobiash, he's already seen that there's going to be a stream of blockers following that attack, and so he kind of shortcuts just a little bit, picks up his cards, starts shuffling. We're going to see a game 3 here between Mark Tobiash and Thomas Morrissey. Morrissey able to get in just enough damage on a key turn that all of that work that Mark Tobiash had been doing to lower his own life total meant that there was a window open for a hasty victory.
Yeah, it was actually just that one top deck, right? To suddenly have offense and defense and counter backup and everything somehow working out for the Goblin deck.
So going into game 3 now, it will be Mark that is on the play for the deciding game. Goblins is one of those decks that, because it can do things with a Goblin Lackey on turn 1, it certainly has a fairly scary turn 1. We will find out just as these guys go through their speedy shuffles exactly how this turn 1 is going to play out. Gitaxian Probe means we're going to see exactly what Thomas Morrissey has going on there. Goblin Ringleader, there's a Tarfire in the mix, a War Chief. Up top, that's a Goblin Lackey. So a pretty good mix of land and spells here for Thomas Morrissey in the early game.
No, I like seeing Cavern of Souls for the Goblin player. I like the turn 1 Lackey. If that doesn't have an immediate impact, then Thomas is looking at a pretty slow hand, but still, it should be quite powerful.
And here's a Thoughtseize follow-up. I believe I also see a Daze in hand for Mark Tobiash. He takes Goblin Lackey just because he wants to get that one out of the equation.
And Daze is not really helpful when you're playing against Cavern of Souls and Goblins. So that's actually, I think, there was a problem in game 2 when Mark was holding at least one Force of Will, maybe multiple Force of Wills, and just couldn't counter anything on Thomas' side.
So we've already seen Cycle Street Wraith, we've already seen Gitaxian Probe and Thoughtseize. So Mark Tobiash on 14 life, in spite of having one of his quote-unquote good dual lands in play in Underground Sea, that's now allowing a Brainstorm. There's a few copies of Polluted Delta in hand, so he will be able to get a shuffle after this if he so chooses.
Yeah, and what he wants to do is he wants to deploy a turn 3 Gurmag Angler. Yeah, that looks reasonable. He could even daze and still do that.
Thomas Morrissey, after having had a hand of so much promise at the start of the game, has to just pass the turn on this second turn.
No, but Thomas's hand was definitely not amazing. Okay, you beat some draws, but if you're playing against Death Shadow on the play, you don't expect your Goblin Lackey to survive and connect. Now Thomas is banking on that ringleader once again. I think that's his best out of getting the necessary card advantage.
As things stand, Mark Tobiasz hitting his lands and spells here. Has an Abrupt Decay ready for whatever low-cost threat comes out of Thomas Morrissey's deck. Morrissey's deck actually having various threats that can't just be dealt with Abrupt Decay. In fact, in Game 2, he had Abrupt Decay in hand and was sat there looking at a Goblin Ringleader that was just too expensive a card for him to be able to destroy it. So Watery Grave coming down here. 11 life left for Mark Tobiasz.
That's a good amount, because now any Death Shadows will be live, but Mark doesn't have to aggressively lower his life total any further.
In fact, it was 11 before that Watery Grave came down, so now just 8. And Gurmag Angler, as you prophesied, does come down. No graveyard left for Mark Tobiasz, but he's got a 5/5, which seems like a fair exchange. So here comes Goblin Matron. This is the consistency that the Goblins deck has. Gets to search up a key creature, and it may be that he's tempted by a Sting Scourger here just to bounce that 5/5, given that the graveyard is now empty.
It's almost as if Thomas has to assume a control role, even though he's playing with a bunch of 1/1s. So it is an interesting matchup to watch. I still think the discrepancy in power level is a bit too high, but who knows? Maybe the Goblin deck actually can take this one down.
I mean, Goblins was a deck that I always enjoyed playing back in the early days of Legacy, but I think that it's a deck that hasn't necessarily gained too terribly much in the most recent sets, and meanwhile, the likes of Gurmag Angler has really changed the face of Legacy.
Oh, don't get me wrong, I also had a Goblin deck of my own, but that was before I played a single tournament.
Rishadan Port the pickup there for Morrissey. Doesn't play it just yet, just electing to go with that Cavern of Souls. And Sting Scourger will keep Gurmag Angler off the battlefield for a reasonable stretch here. A little chip in for one. We talked about the power and or danger of small attacks in the last game. How do you feel about that one, Simon?
Yeah, I think now it's definitely correct to pressure Mark, because it's clear that he doesn't have a Death Shadow at the moment. So yes, your attacks are growing the shadow, but you do also have to win at some point, and these ringleaders and so on will be relevant in that.
Okay, so we have Wastelands once again dealing with Cavern of Souls, meaning that it's that much harder for Thomas Morrissey to sneak through spells in the face of counter magic on the other side of things. That's
a huge play, because Mark disables both Cavern of Souls, and Thomas hasn't resolved anything super scary. So now his dazes are live. I think the second Wasteland really improved his chances of winning here.
And Abrupt Decay on that Ether Vial, meaning that if Thomas Morrissey wants to get creatures into play, he's going to have to fight through counter magic to do so. And we know that is something available to Mark Tobiasz here. Plays a Ponder, elects to shuffle.
No, now you have to find Death Shadow. Actually, another card that was tested in this list when it was more heavily green is Traverse the Ovenwald. Just to really get that one threat to stick.
Does find Death Shadow off the top after a shuffle, after a Ponder. Thomas Morrissey, he's got 6 damage to deal. He has got some Tarfires to work with, but these last few points can be much harder to find than the first ones were. And the first ones were essentially given away by Mark Tobiasz. he's going to force Thomas Morrissey to take the last few points. I like Goblin and Warchief in this spot, though. Giving haste to all of your goblins a big deal.
No days is interesting. Mark opting to let that resolve.
This may signal some sort of removal. There is an abrupt decay for that Goblin Warchief.
Just a quick bit of math. Death Shadow is currently a 7/7 because Mark is on 6, which means that in theory Thomas could take 2 hits, but then Mark is threatening to reduce his own life with a Street Wraith or a fetch land, and then he actually does have a 2-turn clock.
So Mog War Marshal living the dream of being cast and not even having to worry about Echo by immediately blocking. And a post-combat Marsh Casualties. I like this. Deal with both of those Goblin tokens, and there's a follow-up. Here's Gurmag Angler, exactly the right number of cards in the graveyard to be able to cast it.
Please, Tim, please tell me that this is not going to be decided by 3 Tarfires to the face.
I can't tell you that, Simon. I just can't do it. If this game is going to go to Thomas Morrissey, it will be down to a lot of Tarfire. He's already cast the first one. There's another one in hand. He needed to find the third, though, and it doesn't look like he's got there.
He's 1 Tarfire short of winning the game with Burn Spell that's quite a bit worse than Lightning Bolt, if I may say so.
I mean, the really sad thing is that having to play the first Tarfire optimistically has meant that he's in a position where it was much, much easier for Mark to then get the kill. And a Dismember to kill off that Gem Palm Incinerator, enough to make Death's Shadow big enough alongside that Gurmag Angler to close the game out, and that enough for the handshake. Mark Tobiash winning the match 2-1. Death Shadow in Legacy, it's a thing.
Now it is.
Liking that one very, very much indeed. We'll get a chance to see potentially more of Mark Tobiash, currently on 5-0 now in this tournament in the latter stages of today and, of course, tomorrow. For those of you just joining us, we have got 3 days of Magic for you. We have a full Legacy GP on Friday and Saturday. That will be the focus of our video coverage, but for those of you that enjoy Standard, do not fear. We will have the whole of the second day of GP Birmingham Standard Edition happening for you on Sunday, so everything from the beginning of the Sunday play all the way up to our top 8 and our finals, of course, we will be bringing you live here on twitch.tv. So lots and lots of Magic. I'm thoroughly enjoying the Legacy right now, but I am very interested to see exactly what people bring when it comes to Dominaria in Standard. And indeed, I suppose, Dominaria in Legacy, because there have been rumblings around the room of a few Dominaria cards sneaking into various Legacy lists. We've not yet seen Khan Scion of Urza in some of the Red Prison decks, but I know that he's out there. I know that he's trying to sneak his way onto camera here before it gets to the Standard section of the weekend. Be very interested to see that. And, of course, whatever Legacy has to throw at us, because we know there's plenty still in the tank in that regard. Do not go anywhere. Riley and Raph will be back with you with more Magic here from Grand Prix Birmingham soon enough. But from me, Tim, and from Simon Getson here, for now, it's goodbye.